You wake to the sound of marble cracking under the weight of golden statues, each one carved in the likeness of a man who believes himself a god. The year is 39 AD, and you are a senator in the Roman Empire, standing in the shadows of the Palatine Hill as Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus, Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, orders another execution for the crime of insufficient worship. The morning air carries the metallic scent of fear sweat from your fellow senators, mixed with the heavy perfume that clings to the purple silk draping every surface of the imperial palace. Your hands shake as you watch the 23-year-old emperor stroke the neck of his favorite horse, Incitatus, while casually discussing which of your colleagues should die next. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Gaius Caligula ascended to power in 37 AD, carrying the hopes of an entire empire on his shoulders. Born in 12 AD to the beloved general Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, he spent his childhood among Roman legions on the Germanic frontier, where soldiers fashioned tiny military boots for the boy they affectionately called Caligula, Little Boots. Those same soldiers who once bounced him on their knees would later whisper prayers to survive his reign. His early months as emperor appeared promising. Caligula freed political prisoners, restored democratic elections, and distributed generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and Roman citizens. But somewhere between the marble corridors of absolute power and the poisonous whispers of court flatterers, the young man who had once charmed legions began transforming into something Rome had never seen before. An emperor who demanded worship as a living god, while indulging in appetites that horrified even a society accustomed to excess. The first signs appeared during his recovery from a mysterious illness in 38 AD. Palace servants noticed how his eyes would fix on nothing for long minutes, his lips moving in silent conversation with invisible companions. When he emerged from his sickbed, courtiers observed that something fundamental had shifted behind those pale blue eyes. Where once resided calculation now burned an unsettling mixture of paranoia and divine grandiosity. Caligula's transformation manifested first in his relationship with religious ritual. Traditional Roman emperors maintained the careful fiction that they ruled with divine blessing, not as gods themselves. Caligula shattered this boundary with the enthusiasm of a man discovering fire. He ordered temples throughout the empire to replace statues of traditional gods with images of himself, complete with interchangeable heads so his divine appearance could be updated with the seasons. In his private apartments, he constructed elaborate shrines where he would conduct conversations with statues of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. Conversations that servants reported hearing from both sides. Guards stationed outside his chambers grew accustomed to the sound of their emperor's laughter mingling with silence, as if divine voices only he could hear were sharing cosmic jokes about mortal affairs. These religious innovations extended into the realm of the intimate, in ways that scandalized even Rome's jaded aristocracy. Caligula established a cult of imperial worship that required senators and their wives to participate in ceremonies that blurred the lines between political submission and sexual degradation. During one documented ritual in 39 AD, he forced the wife of Senator Marcus Junius Brutus to disrobe before a golden statue of himself while reciting prayers typically reserved for Venus, goddess of love and sexuality. The emperor's sexual appetites became inseparable from his political power, in ways that transformed governance into theatre of the absurd. He maintained a rotating selection of married women from prominent families who were required to attend palace dinners where their primary function was not conversation but display. These women, chosen not for beauty but for their husband's political importance, would be seated according to Caligula's whims, sometimes at his feet like pets, sometimes forced to serve wine while their husbands pretended not to notice their wives' humiliation. Marcus Lepidus, married to Caligula's sister Drusilla, found himself in the peculiar position of watching his emperor brother-in-law publicly fondle his wife during state dinners while simultaneously discussing tax policy and military campaigns. Roman historians recorded that Lepidus would maintain fixed eye contact with whoever was speaking about grain imports or Germanic tribal movements, his jaw muscles working like a man chewing leather, while his wife gasped and moaned at the emperor's touch mere feet away. These dinner performances served multiple purposes in Caligula's psychological landscape. They demonstrated his absolute power over Rome's most powerful families, while simultaneously fulfilling his apparent need for an audience during his most intimate moments. The emperor seemed incapable of experiencing pleasure without witnesses to his dominance, transforming every sexual encounter into a public assertion of imperial authority. His relationship with his sisters transcended even these boundaries. Roman sources, particularly Suetonius and Cassius Dio, documented that Caligula maintained incestuous relationships with all three of his sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, but reserved his most intense devotion for Drusilla. When she died in 38 AD, possibly from fever, though some whispered of poison, Caligula's grief manifested in ways that shocked even a culture familiar with imperial excess. He declared Drusilla a goddess and established a cult in her honor, complete with temples and priests. But his mourning rituals extended far beyond traditional deification. Palace servants reported finding the emperor in Drusilla's former chambers, engaging in elaborate conversations with her clothing, her jewelry, even her cosmetics. He would spend hours arranging and rearranging her belongings while describing his daily activities to these inanimate objects as if she could hear and respond. More disturbing were the reports of Caligula's interactions with Drusilla's body before her funeral. Multiple sources, though writing decades later, claim that the emperor delayed her burial for days while conducting private ceremonies in her presence that combined elements of religious ritual with what can only be described as necrophilic worship. He allegedly anointed her corpse with expensive oils while reciting love poetry and political plans, treating her death as merely another transformation in their relationship rather than its end. These intimate rituals with the dead extended to his treatment of executed enemies. When Caligula ordered the death of political rivals, he frequently insisted on personal involvement in their final moments that went far beyond traditional execution protocols. He would require condemned prisoners to be brought to private chambers where he could observe and participate in their deaths while in various states of undress, combining the ultimate expression of imperial power, the right to kill, with sexual arousal. One particularly documented case involved Senator Gnaeus Piso, accused of conspiracy in 40 AD. Rather than the traditional beheading or forced suicide typically accorded to members of the senatorial class, Caligula ordered Piso brought to his private bathhouse. There, surrounded by steam and the echoing acoustics of marble walls, the emperor personally tortured Piso while wearing nothing but gold jewelry and a crown of laurel leaves. Witnesses described how Caligula would alternate between inflicting pain and pleasuring himself, as if the senator's suffering and his own arousal were components of the same ritual. The emperor's fascination with death as an intimate experience extended to his treatment of gladiators and arena spectacles. Traditional emperors might attend gladiatorial games as political theatre, demonstrating their power through the control of life and death. Caligula transformed these public spectacles into extensions of his private appetites. He would order specific gladiators brought to his private viewing box during combat, requiring them to fight while he masturbated mere feet away, their blood and sweat mingling with his sexual excitement. His most notorious arena innovation involved the systematic humiliation of Rome's aristocratic women through forced participation in gladiatorial combat. Unlike the professional female gladiators who occasionally fought in the arena, these were wives and daughters of senators compelled to fight against professional opponents while wearing minimal armor that emphasized their vulnerability and exposed flesh. Caligula would position himself at the arena's edge during these contests, close enough to hear their breathing and see the terror in their eyes as they faced trained killers. The emperor's collection of intimate rituals expanded to include elaborate ceremonies centered around his horse, Incitatus. While history remembers the story of Caligula threatening to make his horse a consul, the reality of his relationship with the animal was far more complex and disturbing. Palace servants reported regular marriage ceremonies between the emperor and Incitatus, complete with exchanged vows and wedding feasts where the horse would be hand-fed delicacies, while Caligula delivered speeches about their eternal love. These ceremonies typically concluded with Caligula engaging in sexual acts in the horse's presence, apparently believing that Incitatus served as witness to his divine virility. The emperor constructed elaborate sleeping quarters next to the horse's stable, where he would spend nights curled against the animal while discussing state secrets and personal fears that he trusted to no human confidant. The psychological foundation underlying these behaviors reveals itself through examination of Caligula's childhood trauma and the impossible pressures of imperial power. His father Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances when Caligula was 7 years old, possibly poisoned by rivals of Emperor Tiberius. His mother Agrippina the Elder spent years in exile and eventual imprisonment, leaving young Gaius to navigate the treacherous politics of the imperial court without family protection. Tiberius, who raised Caligula after his parents' deaths, was himself a deeply troubled ruler who spent his final years in self-imposed exile on the island of Capri, surrounded by rumors of sexual perversion and cruelty. The adolescent Caligula witnessed and possibly participated in Tiberius's legendary debaucheries, including the emperor's reported fondness for using children as sexual playthings during elaborate dinner parties that combined fine dining with systematic abuse. Under Tiberius's tutelage, Caligula learned that absolute power meant absolute freedom from moral constraints. The older emperor allegedly encouraged his heirs' developing appetites, viewing them as natural expressions of imperial authority. Servants from this period reported observing teenage Caligula practicing speeches while young slaves were tortured for his entertainment, learning to associate power with the infliction of suffering and the witnessing of degradation. When Caligula assumed power at age 24, he inherited not only the vast machinery of Roman government, but also a court culture that had spent decades normalizing the association between political authority and sexual domination. His innovations built upon foundations laid by predecessors, but with an intensity and creativity that suggested genuine psychological compulsion rather than mere political calculation. His marriage to Caesonia in 39 AD provided the most sustained glimpse into Caligula's intimate psychology. Unlike his previous 3 marriages, which had been brief political arrangements, his relationship with Caesonia lasted until his assassination in 41 AD. She was neither particularly beautiful nor well-connected, leading historians to speculate about the nature of their bond. Contemporary accounts describe Caesonia as unusually willing to participate in and encourage Caligula's most extreme behaviors. She allegedly helped design and orchestrate many of the humiliation rituals imposed on aristocratic families, suggesting scenarios and refinements that increased both the psychological impact on victims and the emperor's sexual excitement. Palace servants reported that Caesonia would often be present during Caligula's torture sessions, offering commentary and encouragement while the emperor combined violence with sexual release. Their marriage ceremony itself established patterns that would define their relationship. Rather than the traditional Roman wedding rituals, Caligula created an elaborate spectacle that lasted for days and involved the forced participation of dozens of aristocratic families. Guests were required to witness not only the ceremonial aspects of the union, but also its physical consummation, which took place on a platform erected in the palace's main courtyard, while senators and their wives stood in carefully arranged circles, forbidden from looking away. Caesonia apparently thrived in this environment of orchestrated degradation and public sexuality. Sources describe her as an active participant rather than a victim, someone who found genuine pleasure in the exercise of power over others through sexual humiliation. She would regularly suggest new victims for their joint attention, identifying women whose husbands had shown insufficient enthusiasm for the emperor's latest demands, or men whose wealth made them attractive targets for elaborate blackmail schemes. Their daughter Julia Drusilla, born in 39 AD, became another component of Caligula's ritual life in ways that horrified even the imperial court's jaded observers. The emperor would conduct elaborate ceremonies celebrating the infant's divine nature, during which he would hold the naked baby while discussing her future role as a goddess and his eternal companion. These ceremonies typically concluded with Caligula engaging in sexual acts while holding his daughter, apparently believing that her presence blessed and amplified his divine virility. Palace servants reported finding elaborate shrines in the imperial nursery where Caligula would conduct private worship sessions that combined traditional prayers to Roman gods with sexualized devotions to his infant daughter's supposed divine essence. He commissioned statues depicting himself and the baby in poses that shocked even the sculptors forced to create them, paying enormous sums to ensure their silence about the exact nature of what they had carved. The emperor's treatment of male courtiers and slaves revealed additional dimensions of his psychological landscape. Unlike his interactions with women, which typically emphasized dominance and humiliation, his relationships with certain men seemed to fulfill different emotional needs. He maintained a rotating collection of young male slaves who served not only as sexual partners, but as confidants for his most paranoid fantasies and grandiose delusions. These young men, typically purchased as children and trained specifically for imperial service, occupied a unique position in Caligula's world. They were simultaneously the most trusted individuals in the empire, privy to state secrets and personal confessions, and the most disposable, liable to execution for the slightest perceived betrayal, or simply for witnessing too much of the emperor's vulnerability. Marcus, a teenage slave who served Caligula for nearly 2 years before his documented execution in 40 AD, left behind fragments of testimony preserved by palace servants. Through these accounts we glimpse Caligula's private fears and obsessions, his terror of assassination, his conviction that God spoke directly to him, his belief that sexual conquest represented the purest form of political control, and his growing paranoia about the loyalty of literally everyone around him. Marcus's testimony describes elaborate nighttime rituals during which Caligula would require the young slave to dress as various Roman gods, while the emperor performed sexual acts and delivered lengthy monologues about his divine nature and cosmic responsibilities. These sessions would sometimes last for hours, with Caligula moving between intense sexual activity and rambling philosophical discussions about the nature of power, godhood, and mortality. The emperor's fears about death manifested in ritualistic behaviors that combined sexual activity with elaborate protective ceremonies. He would require multiple partners to be present during his most intimate moments, apparently believing that witnesses to his virility could somehow ward off assassination attempts. These sessions took place in rooms surrounded by armed guards and lit by dozens of oil lamps, creating an atmosphere of paranoid sexuality that infected everyone present. His relationships with the Praetorian Guard revealed another facet of his psychological needs. Unlike previous emperors who maintained formal distance from their bodyguards, Caligula regularly invited guardsmen to participate in his intimate rituals, apparently viewing their physical protection as inseparable from their presence during his sexual activities. These men, chosen for loyalty and discretion, found themselves required to witness and sometimes participate in scenarios that tested even their professional stoicism. Centurion Cassius Chaerea, who would eventually lead the conspiracy that killed Caligula, spent months observing the emperor's private behaviors before concluding that assassination was the only solution to what he termed the divine madness. His later testimony describes rituals during which Caligula would require guardsmen to remain at attention while he engaged in sexual acts mere feet away, their professional discipline preventing any reaction to what they witnessed. These exhibitions served multiple purposes in Caligula's psychology. They demonstrated his power over men trained for violence. They provided him with an audience for his sexual performances, and they created a network of compromised witnesses whose shared knowledge bound them to his service through mutual guilt and shame. The emperor understood that men who had watched him engage in activities they found revolting were unlikely to betray him, since their own complicity made them vulnerable to retribution. The spatial organization of Caligula's palaces reflected his need to blend public authority with private appetite. He commissioned extensive renovations that eliminated traditional boundaries between staterooms and private chambers, creating a fluid environment where political meetings could seamlessly transition into sexual exhibitions and back again. Visiting dignitaries might find themselves witnessing torture sessions during what they had expected to be routine diplomatic discussions, while intimate encounters with the emperor could suddenly expand to include negotiations about trade agreements or military campaigns. These architectural innovations served practical purposes beyond mere convenience. By eliminating physical boundaries between public and private spaces, Caligula created an environment where traditional social rules and expectations became impossible to maintain. Senators arriving for political meetings could never be certain whether they would be discussing taxation or watching their wives perform degrading acts, keeping Rome's elite in a constant state of anxious uncertainty that enhanced the emperor's control over their behavior. The emperor's fascination with theatrical performance found expression in elaborate staged scenarios that combined elements of drama, politics, and sexuality. He would commission writers to create scripts for scenarios involving specific senators and their families, then require these individuals to perform their assigned roles while he watched and masturbated. These productions might last for hours, with complex plots involving betrayal, humiliation, and reconciliation that served as vehicles for the emperor's sexual excitement. One documented production involved Senator Lucius Vitellius and his wife Plotia, who were required to perform a scripted dialogue about marital infidelity, while gradually removing their clothing and engaging in sexual acts according to Caligula's detailed stage directions. The emperor positioned himself at the center of the scene, directing their performances while pleasuring himself and providing running commentary on their technique and emotional authenticity. These theatrical productions revealed Caligula's sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. He seemed to recognize that forcing